The modern instructional design industry prioritizes a specific ideal, making learning as smooth and effortless as possible. We remove complexity and pave a straight, easy road from objective to assessment. But this frictionless approach often fails when we measure long-term retention. Information that is too easy to consume glides right through short-term memory and vanishes without leaving a lasting impact. We spend massive resources removing every conceivable cognitive obstacle, only to find that removing those hurdles actually flatlines learner engagement. Effective learning requires the strategic introduction of cognitive friction. True cognitive friction is the mental effort required when learners assemble data themselves, rather than a result of poor UI or confusing text. To understand why, we need to map the capacity limits of our working memory, analyze fMRI data on brain activation during reading, and look at how deploying counterexamples forces deeper encoding. Ultimately, long-term retention depends on strategic difficulty, even when it conflicts with the desire for a smooth user experience. E-learning designer Kathy Moore evaluates whether a course is action-oriented by looking at a specific dichotomy. Does the material tell the learner, or does it show them? Telling a learner explicitly states whether an answer is correct or incorrect. It spoon-feeds the conclusion, denying the learner the opportunity to draw that conclusion on their own. We can see the neurological impact of this deductive effort in a 2006 study by researcher Gina Kuperberg, which measured how the brain processes different pairs of sentences. The subjects were given a main sentence. The next day, his body was covered in bruises, preceded by one of 3 different statements. The first statement was highly causally related. Joey's brother punched him again and again. This requires 0 deductive effort. The second sentence pair was only intermediately related. Joey's brother became furiously angry with him, which requires reading between the lines. The third option was completely unrelated. Joey went to a neighbor's house to play. The researchers mapped the subject's brain activation across all 3 scenarios to see how neural processing responded to the varying levels of required reasoning. The data revealed a massive spike in brain activation, along with longer reading times, exclusively aligned with the intermediately related sentence. Because the text didn't explicitly provide the answer, the brain was forced to build the bridge between furiously angry and covered in bruises. That active process of connecting the dots generates the friction necessary for deep encoding. Since measurable neurological effort creates memory, instructional content must intentionally leave gaps for the learner to close. Moving from theory to applied instructional design requires us to look at how we format our content. We have to transform standard information dumps into high-friction scenarios. This table shows a comparison of instructional approaches. On the left, we see the standard corporate training format. It relies heavily on passive, bulleted lectures to convey rules, telling the learner exactly what to think. Contrast that with the scenario-based approach on the right. Instead of stating rules for encountering a stopped school bus, the instructor interrogates the learner's concerns. What would people be worried about? This forces the learner to anticipate real-world consequences. The corporate scenario involving employee compensation demonstrates exactly how to apply this shift. The low-friction approach is to provide the learner with a mathematical formula for calculating pay rates and expecting them to retain it. A high-friction solution presents the learner with raw, unstructured data. We give them Jane's company history, her qualifications, and the salary histories for the rest of her team, and require the learner to calculate the final promotion rate themselves. Forcing the learner to parse and synthesize this raw information triggers the exact same neurological activation we saw in the Kuperberg study. In group training settings, you can multiply this friction by introducing interpersonal interaction. Having learners argue different sides of a debate or rank order 5 different examples forces them to articulate and defend their deductive leaps. Providing raw data instead of synthesized conclusions forces a critical shift. The learner stops being a passive observer and becomes an active investigator. This raises an immediate operational question. If cognitive effort is beneficial, shouldn't we make our instructional modules as dense and complex as possible? We can't because we are bound by the hard limit of human working memory. Working memory acts as a temporary holding zone. For a learner to process deliberate friction, that finite container must remain clear enough to manipulate the essential data. If we start adding non-essential, nice-to-know details, like explaining streusel variations or gluten theories to a novice pie baker, those extraneous facts rapidly flood the buffer. The system becomes overwhelmed and processing fails. This creates the designer's primary, non-negotiable mandate, the ruthless management and reduction of extraneous cognitive load. This principle also dismantles the persistent industry myth that adults had a fixed biological attention span limited to 10 or 15 minutes. Humans regularly maintain deep focus during 11-hour movie marathons of the extended Lord of the Rings editions. Attention is dictated by engagement and the ability to process the narrative, not by a stopwatch. A learner's attention breaks down only when an overloaded working memory can no longer keep up with a disorganized, dense data stream. To make learning stick, designers must aggressively strip away non-essential details. We have to preserve the brain's limited bandwidth so it can process deliberate, productive friction. Even when we balance load and friction, we still have to contend with pre-existing learner misconceptions that can contaminate how new information is processed. Simply providing correct, positive examples of a concept is often insufficient to correct these deep-seated misunderstandings. This table shows guidelines for creating true-false questions. To accurately map a concept, we have to pair strong positive examples with deliberate, explicit counterexamples. By juxtaposing a perfectly executed question asking about a single variable directly against a specifically flawed version containing multiple variables, we define the exact parameters of success. The negative example acts as a structural boundary. It keeps the learner's understanding from drifting into incorrect assumptions about how a rule should be applied. You can push this even further by presenting learners with terrible examples first, asking them to identify the flaws before you ever teach the rule. This leverages both contrast and deductive friction. Negative examples are never wasted space. They are essential structural guardrails that safely contain and direct the learner's cognitive effort. This graph synthesizes the relationship between content volume and cognitive demand. We have cognitive load on the x-axis and cognitive friction on the y-axis. The quadrant where instructional design actually yields results is here, the zone of low load combined with high friction. To reach this zone, we have to move away from providing explicit answers. Our toolkit must rely on providing raw data, building active scenarios, and defining boundaries with clear counterexamples. Designers are often pressured to deliver a finished, polished conclusion for the learner. But the real work is in curating the raw evidence and stripping away the noise, leaving the learner to generate the final insight themselves.